again, slightly different setup today. Normally I'd have the camera at the back, a few lights, bits and bobs around to help with the sound quality, but to be honest, all that setup time kind of puts me off making these videos. So I've gone for something much simpler today. Pop the camera on a stool, a single light, nothing else, and we'll see what the quality's like. Hopefully it's going to be good enough, and then that will encourage me to make a few more videos and get posting a bit more regularly. So today's video is really to answer the question, can you make super fast bread that is still super tasty? And I believe the answer is yes, particularly if you get a bit of help from your sourdough starter. Now we're not going to be making sourdough bread, we're just going to be using this kind of as a pre-ferment to help boost the flavour of our bread. And as we've got so much flavour in here, we can cut down on the processes that normally generate flavour, like fermentation time, to make a super fast loaf that is still really tasty. So every weekend I use my basic white bread dough to bake kind of 2 utility loaves that get us through the week in toast and sandwiches and whatnot. One we start eating straight away, the other I wrap up and put in the freezer, and that is a routine I have been sticking to for about 6 years. So that's what we're going to try and do today. Just get 2 nice loaves baked really quickly, but still packing a punch in the flavour. So for this recipe you will need 1.1 kilos of strong white bread flour. I've already got that weighed out in here. Then you're going to need 200 grams of sourdough starter. Now, you don't have to be too particular about this. Basically, the concept is, whatever your normal bread recipe is, you can swap out a percentage of the flour and the water for sourdough starter. So normally I would use 1.2 kilos of flour, but for this I'll take it down to 1.1 and then add 200 grams of starter. Because remember, that starter is 50-50 flour water, so that'll be 100 grams of flour in the starter going back in. Then the water, normally I would use 780 grams of water, but I'm going to bring that down to 650, so taking out just over 100 grams. You could just take out the 100, but once the starter's been sat in the fridge for about a week, it does become a little bit more liquid. It loses its structure and its integrity, so I tend to drop the hydration a bit just to combat that. If you find the dough is very stiff, then you can add a little bit more water, no problem. And then we're still using 2 grams of salt, so technically that should be 24 grams for this recipe, but I use 20 just to help reduce the salt intake a bit. And then 12 grams of instant yeast, but again I boost that a little bit and I'm going to use 15 just to ensure we get a good rise and really speed up this process. I'm going to see if we can get this done within 2 hours. So, like I say, 1.1 kilos of the strong white bread flour, and now let's get our starter in. Here we go. So 200 grams. That's probably going to be pretty much all of it. You can see it's quite loose because that has been sat in the fridge all week. Now it looks like I've used it all up, but there's still enough in there to refeed, and that'll tick over again for another week, and it'll just keep my starter alive over these summer months. So to that, like I say, the 650 grams of water, in that goes, in with the salt, in with the yeast, and I also like to splosh in a bit of olive oil just to help with a nice soft crumb, and also helps with the sort of how long the loaf will keep over the week. Keeps it nice and soft in the bread bin. So about 60 grams of that. And now into the mixer. We'll start it off on a low speed so it doesn't splosh everywhere. There we go, you can hear the air sort of coming out. There we go. Now I think the camera might have been jiggling around whilst that was going, so that's something I need to consider. That's mixed for about 5 minutes. It's looking nicely incorporated. We'll just scrape that off the dough hook. Like that. There we go. As usual, just scrape around the sides of the bowl, bring it all into the middle. Looks something like that. And now cover with a tea towel. And we'll leave that to proof. Literally an hour should do it. I am using tepid water or slightly warm water. Everything I can to just boost the speed of this. So really, in an hour, that should be doming and we'll be ready to shape. Okay, so whilst that is finishing proofing, I'm going to grab a quick cup of tea and talk to you about maintaining a fridge starter. So, normally over the summer months I don't really bake sourdough, so I would just let my starter die. I get rid of it and I'd start a new one in the autumn, but this year I am going to try and keep it going, but I'm just going to be keeping it in the fridge and only feeding it once a week. So what I do is on the weekend, for instance, I will discard most of it, like I say, throw it away. I know a lot of people think it's wasteful, but I'm going to be feeding this with about 100 grams of flour a week. So that's about, say, 500 grams a month. So we're talking a bag of flour, 1.5 kilo bag of flour for 3 months. So that might be £1 to keep it going for 3 months. So I am not really worrying about being wasteful, but if I'm going to bake waffles or this bread recipe I'm showing you now, then it's there and I can use it. I see on Facebook a lot of questions about maintaining a fridge starter, how mature it should be, how long you should keep it out of the fridge before it's ready to go in the fridge, and why sometimes it goes mouldy in the fridge and other times why it kind of separates and you get that layer of hooch on top, the brown liquid. So first of all, you do want your starter to be fairly well established before it goes in the fridge. So once you've had it up and running for maybe up to a month, I mean, it's going to take you a good 2 weeks to get it going, so another 2 weeks to get it really established, and then you can probably start thinking about keeping it in the fridge and just feeding it once a week. When it comes to how long you should keep it in and out of the fridge once it's in there, then I would, if I'm using it for waffles or something, I'd just take it straight out the fridge and use what's in there from cold. But when it comes to feeding it, I'll take it out, discard it or use it, add my flour and water, so 100 grams of flour, 100 grams of water, and then I will leave that at room temperature till I see some good activity. It doesn't need to peak all the way up and start dropping. In fact, I'd rather catch it on the way up. So maybe something like 4 hours, see some action, and then put it back in the fridge. If you feed it and then put it directly in the fridge, the yeast is never really going to sort of wake up and get going again. And in effect, all that sort of raw flour and water you've mixed together is just going to go and sit in the fridge for a week. And that is why it tends to go off and starts moulding. There's no sort of enzyme activity there to keep the sort of bad bacteria at bay. It's not sort of an active living environment. So you do want it to get going a bit, like I say, about 4 hours, wait till you see some action, and then get it in the fridge and it'll gradually go dormant again and sit there quite comfortably for a week. If you push it beyond that, then that's when you're likely to get that kind of splitting where you see you've got your starter at the bottom and then you start to create this sort of pool of brown liquid on top. That's called hooch. That's alcohol that's emitted by the yeast. Now a lot of people say just stir it in and carry on. I tend not to. I'd pour that away. Actually, yeast doesn't like alcohol, so if you start creating a very alcoholic, acidic environment in there, it's going to be harder for your wild yeast to get going. So I'd always say tip that away and then just refeed it with your 100 grams of flour, 100 grams of water. If it's getting very thick because of the liquid you've tipped away, then add a little bit water. But as you saw earlier when I was using this in the video, I'm pretty much using all of it or throwing all of it away. So what's left in there is not really going to affect the hydration of your starter that much. So that's pretty much how I will keep my starter over the summer months. And if you want to keep yours in the fridge, that is how I recommend you do it. Cheers. Okay, so that's been an hour. We can see we're just doming over the top of the bowl. To be honest, I would probably leave that for another half an hour, but speed is of the essence. I want to show you that you can really rattle through this. So we'll just leave it for the hour and we'll still get 2 good loaves at the end. So a little bit of flour on our worktop. I'm using rice flour. If you can get hold of it, it's excellent for sort of all the shaping work, but if not, just a bit of regular bread flour will be fine. Scrape our dough out. Here it comes. As always, try not to tear it too much, overstretch it or break it up into pieces, just one big lump. Get it into a sort of manageable cylinder, and now I'm going to divide that in 2. There we go, and then use my dough scraper just to release it. And I am actually just going to weigh these. I've sort of been getting in the habit of scaling my bread just so my loaves are the same size. That'll be fine. And so it's just a case of shaping them. So we'll just do a single shape. Again, time is of the essence. So stretch it out into a kind of rectangular shape, making sure it's not sticking to the work surface. Pull the 2 sides in. Then I fold the 2 corners over to make a point in the middle, and then that point's the one I roll in, and then just use your hands to squeeze it down, sort of sealing it every time it rolls in. And then you end up with your nice taut cylinder. If you get a sort of end that looks a bit like that, you can tuck it in and just pinch that down. There we go, and then you end up with a really nice, neat package. Because there's not too much tension in there, but there's enough that will proof up nicely. So into your baking tin. I've lined mine with baking parchment because those tins are really sticky now. But if you've got sort of fairly new non-stick tins or you season them properly, then probably no need for the paper. A little bit more rice flour. So again, stretch it out, making sure it's not sticking. The 2 sides in, corner, corner, leaving you with the point in the middle, and then that is the point that gets rolled over and tucked in. Rolling and pushing. There we go. Seam goes on the bottom. Just pinch those 2 ends in. And there we go, we've got another nice taut cylinder. That goes in, and we're going to cover these again with a tea towel and leave them to proof half an hour or probably 40 minutes. So what I'm going to do is leave them for half an hour, and at that point I will put my oven on to preheat. Again, I only preheat my oven for about 10 minutes. A lot of recipes say preheat it for 2 hours or an hour or 2 hours beforehand, but my God, I'm just burning electricity doing that. So 10 minutes is absolutely fine, and then we will get these baked. Alrighty, they've been proofing for 40 minutes, looking nice and puffy. That really is a lovely tea towel, isn't it? But looking nice and puffed up, ready to bake. You know the drill. Get your oven preheated to maximum. For me, that's about 240, 250 degrees. Have a roasting tray in the bottom of the oven ready. Then I'm going to bake these for 10 minutes at that high temperature with some water in that roasting tray to create steam. Then I'll turn the oven down to 200 degrees, maybe 180 if they're browning very fast, and bake them for another 23 minutes. I know I always say I like a round top on these loaves and I don't score them, but I have been tending to slash them recently because although I do like that round top, I get a bit fed up with the lopsided loaves when one side blows and the other side doesn't. So I'm going to give these just a straight score down the middle like that. I'll get them in the oven, then I'm going to get them cooled on a wire rack, and then I can show you the results, see if it's all been worth it. Okay, there we have it, the final loaves, looking pretty good, puffed up nicely, nice colour, good crispy crust. These have only cooled for about 10 minutes, so they're still quite warm, but I do want to cut into one just to show you what it looks like, but more importantly, give it a little taste up. But I need to get the video done before the kids get home from school and the wife gets home from work. So let's just cut a little bit of this crust off. It's still going to be very steamy inside and it's kind of dragged a little bit. This is why you don't want to cut into it too early, because you can see it starts making it look a bit doughy, but trust me, that is cooked through. I'll give that a little taste. Straight away, even just breathing in those sort of fumes coming out of it, I'm getting that sourdough note. You're really getting a bit of extra flavour there. And that's amazing for a loaf that's literally taken us under 3 hours to make. So I can conclude it definitely works and you can make tasty bread quickly. But a few things to note before we wrap this up. Firstly, you're not using that starter in there as the leaven, so you do need the commercial yeast. That starter's been sat in the fridge for a week, dormant, it's risen, it's fallen, just generating flavour, and now we're using that in the loaf just for the flavour, and the raising is coming from the commercial yeast. Now, I used about 15 grams today because I wanted to speed this process along, but you could use way less than that. You could just use 2 grams and do a long bulk fermentation, a long final proof, but that kind of defeats the purpose for me. If I was going to spend that long making my bread, I'd probably just make a proper loaf of sourdough. I'd get better texture, better flavour. So the point of this is really capturing some of those flavours, but making a quick bread. Now secondly, the amount of starter you use, again, that's kind of up to you. If you're someone that only maintains a very small amount of starter, maybe 30 to 50 grams, adding the discard from that's probably not going to make a huge amount of difference. So you want to sort of go for around 20% like we've done today, but you could probably double that to say 40% and really boost those flavours. My only concern would be that the higher the amount of starter you add, the kind of less structure you might find in the dough. Basically, that starter, the gluten's broken down, there's been a lot of enzyme activity, it's kind of done its thing. So just bear in mind, if you're using a really high proportion of it, you may struggle to shape like a freestanding cob loaf. But if you're doing a tinned loaf, it'll probably still work. Give it an experiment, leave your comments below and let me know. And if you are someone that only maintains a small amount of starter, I would suggest you kind of, every time you feed it, rather than discarding it, keep it in a separate bowl in the fridge, and you should build up over time enough to be able to follow this recipe, get around 200 grams of starter. If that's going to take you like a month to do, then I suggest you keep it in the freezer. Just add it to the freezer every time in one pot, and then once you've reached your 200 grams, then you can take it out of the freezer the night before you're going to use it. But just think of this as a concept. Sure, follow the recipe I've given you, follow those amounts, but basically whatever basic bread dough recipe you're comfortable using, the one you use week in, week out, use that, but just substitute some of the flour and some of the water for your starter. It's very simple to work out. If you want to use 200 grams of starter, then you'll need to take out 100 grams of flour and 100 grams of water, as long as your starter's 100% hydration, of course. So have a little experiment, let me know how you get on, either leave comments below or head over to buzzbybakes.com and you can contact me there via email and send me any pictures. I'd love to see how this works for you. If you've enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up, and hopefully it won't be too long until I post my next one. But as always, until next time, that's right, happy baking.